Hello and welcome to the Real Bible Rub podcast. Today, I would like to talk about Israel. And I know that every time you talk about Israel, people get emotional. It's such an important topic. And the question is why does Israel play such an outsized role in the world? Um, and why this is kind of like wagging the dog. You've heard of that term, the tail wagging the dog. Why does this nation of approximately 9 million people play such a huge role in for the rest of us, for the other 8.5 billion people in the world? Why does the United States react the way it does, and why do the people in the Middle East react the way they do? And I know that whenever I talk about Israel, whether online or with even in person, even with people in my own congregation, there's an emotional reaction that happens, especially in recent times. And there's a lot of good reason for it. And I'd like to kind of tell you a little bit about some of my personal history with Israel and understanding that, because I used to visit Israel fairly often for business purposes and have a little bit of insight that maybe not a lot of people have. Plus, I want to talk a little bit about how Paul talks about Israel and how it played an outsized role in the Roman Empire for not only for him, but also in how the Jewish diaspora really drove a lot of the activity in Eastern Mediterranean. How Alexander the Great really made it so that the Jewish diaspora spread around a lot. And how this causes people to react in a couple of different ways. One is many religious people will look at it, well, this is God's will. They'll look toward end times. They'll look toward the book of Revelation and say, well, obviously God's chosen people in Israel is the cause for all of this. There's something deeper here. I tend to not react that way because I think that that's supersessionist. That means taking away from history and just laying theology on top of history rather than looking at history in kind of a cold-eyed way that we should, in an objective way. So what I'll do is I'll start a little bit with some of my personal story. Then I'll talk a little bit about the history of where does Israel sit. Then I'll talk a little bit about why is Israel so important today and how really the parallel to what Paul was dealing with in Romans chapter 9 and how that fits together. And I do this with tremendous sensitivity and respect because I have several Jewish friends. I have some Jewish people in my congregation. I know Israelis, and I have a deep admiration for many things that are in Judaism and for people who are associated with the state of Israel. But I also am deeply critical of especially the Israeli government today. And I think that what I'm saying is very much in line with how Israelis feel today that I know, and also a moderate view, because Israel is used to radicalize both the right, the Christian right, and the left, the non-Christian and the Christian left. And it's a very fraught thing to do. So let me start a little bit about some of my personal history with Israel. I've been going to Israel for about 30 years for business purposes. In the late 90s, I was there, mid to late 90s, I was there several times because I was in the electronics industry, and I was going around the world training people on how to design circuits in the technology that I was selling, which is 3.5 semiconductors, gallium arsenide semiconductors, gallium nitride, and so forth. And that was a wonderful experience for me because I got to interact with a lot of different people. But then many years later, ran the sales effort in Europe and Middle East and Africa, which included Israel, um, about 15 years ago or so. And I led that for a while. And this is all before I went into ministry. So I've been involved with the church for a very long time as a ruling elder, basically as a non-clergy person, and then I became clergy within the last decade, and now I lead a church. So I have this kind of dual feeling about it. I've never been to Israel solely as a Christian tourist, for example, but I've seen a lot of people that have done that, and I have become aware of that, especially as I speak with other pastors and people in the Christian world. So I have some feeling for that too. But there's one incident that kind of gives me a perspective that may be helpful to you, and I'll speak about this in a sermon coming up. And I have to be real careful when I speak about Israel in my congregation, because I do have a couple of Jewish people, and I have people who are married to Jewish people, and there's a variety of opinions. There's people who feel embattled by what's going on. There are people who are very much worried about the Free Palestine movement that's going on. I live in Seattle area, so with some of the more liberal people in Seattle, Free Palestine's a big deal. So I have to be careful to be very, to be nuanced about it. And this story kind of helps. Back in 2011, I was in the waiting room in Ashdod, Israel, for the IAI, which is IAI is the Israeli Aerospace Industries, and their unit that's there in Ashdod used to be called ELTA, and they were a prime contractor, maybe the prime contractor for the Iron Dome system. And this is the ballistic missile system that Israel had developed over the last couple of decades. So you might remember the United States provided Patriot missile systems to Israel, and this is a Raytheon product, the Patriot system. And Israel then simultaneously worked on their own system, and this is a system that called Iron Dome. And Iron Dome is largely funded by the United States, and it uses radar to detect incoming missiles, and then does very quick calculations about the trajectory of the missiles, and then makes a decision about whether to automatically launch anti-ballistic missiles. and I'm getting some of the terminology wrong, but this is essentially how it works. And the technology is just stunning. First of all, you have to have very high precision radar. Some of these missiles aren't very big. They're only a few meters long, right? And maybe in some even smaller. And they constantly were coming out of Gaza. They still do. And Hamas in the mid 2000s and later 2000s were beginning to really ramp up their missile attacks on a few miles around Gaza, and constantly harassing the Israelis. This was part of their campaign to destabilize Israel. And make no, Hamas is not the Palestinian people. Hamas is largely Iranian funded extremists, just like Hezbollah is up in Lebanon, and other groups. Basically, a proxy for Iran. And the Israelis had their first generation Iron Dome, did a pretty good job of keeping a lot of a lot of those rockets from landing in populated areas. And a big part of this system is that you can easily overwhelm anti-missile defense, because if you shoot so many of them, there's no way you can counter that. So the big thing about this is to have such precision of your radar and being able to calculate the trajectory so that you can ignore the ones that are just going to go into open fields, or because these are not accurate systems. These missiles are not guided, so you can ignore most of them, and only the ones that you calculate to hit population centers or critical targets. Then only those ones do you launch a counter measure, a missile that goes up and hits it. And you just think about, these things are traveling very fast, so they have to do all of this calculation. They have to do it in less than a minute, in seconds. All of this has to go on. It's just stunning, the technology that goes into this. And that was fairly effective, but people were getting killed constantly. Just a few people here and there, in the kibbutzes that are around that area, and so forth. And then what happened is the Iron Dome came into being, and the first generation was pretty clunky, used tons of power. There's lots of details about how, but it did work. It did prevent outright panic in Israel. Because they were able to knock down between 80 and 90% of the incoming rockets. But as time went on, the rockets were getting bigger, longer range, and they were becoming more menacing. And there was always this race between the Iron Dome system and the capability of the rockets. And as time was going on, as the rockets started becoming a bigger menace, or having longer range, they were starting to threaten places like Ashdod, which is about 25 miles from Gaza, and where the defense industry, a lot of the defense industry and a lot of people are. And you can just imagine it's going to start, going over to Tel Aviv and other major population centers. This is becoming a big, big problem. Now, so I represented a company, or I was part of a company that made the transistors for these radar systems, and it was a key. We had a key technology that would really help to upgrade these radars to make them much more effective, much more power efficient, smaller, so that they could deploy them a lot more easily, and a lot more capable. And it did turn out to be true. It did turn out that these key technologies would then would be able to suppress it. So I went into this, and I was the sort of the person to negotiate a contract with this organization. And I had a very capable Israeli sales manager and salesperson. The salesperson was a man who was an Orthodox Jew, so he wore the yarmulke and the tassels and everything. He wasn't an ultra-Orthodox, so he did interact with society and everything, but he definitely was a conservative Jewish person. And then my sales manager was a woman, and she's Jewish as well, but she was more of a secular Jew, but still very much them. And they accompanied me into a price negotiation, which was one of the more difficult price negotiations I've ever been in. And the customer took full advantage of the fact of my sympathies. And this is kind of something, if you ever do a major negotiation in this kind of environment, especially for critical technology that the customer really needs, they'll play hardball. And they'll bring out their sob stories about how they can't make it without the a good price, and you have to give them all these concessions and stuff. That you get sob stories all the time. And you but the difference here is that overhanging this meeting was a real challenge, is that because I knew, and they took full advantage of the fact that this is an existential thing for them. They need this technology. There was one competitor that could provide some version of this technology, but not like we could. So you could say, well, we had an advantage, but they were brutal. They were very abusive. The one man was toward me, program director, and it just made me wonder how this is U.S. funded. I was there to help them. And this was kind of a microcosm of the relationship. So I spent like 6 hours there just getting really ripped apart by them. And of course, being a salesperson, you're kind of in between the company and the customer. And so you're trying to represent your company, but you're also helping your company understand the customer. So there's a lot of that going on. And it made me wonder, I go, how I'm really their advocate, but they're mistreating me and they're kind of wagging me. And it made me wonder. Now, like I said, I love Israeli people. Price negotiations never easy in Israel. Any kind of commercial activity, they're tough people. They kind of take a lot of pride in their toughness because they're survivors, right? And then years later, in 2023, on October 7th, this is when Hamas broke out of Gaza and massacred, raped, murdered, and imprisoned thousands of Israelis. And there's a lot of reasons why this happened. A lot of it has to do with sort of the geopolitics and Iran, Israel creating an environment that's extremely frustrating to Palestinians. So the reaction of Hamas, you could take maybe they're just taking advantage of the situation, but the brutality of what they did is just inexcusable. And so after this happened, you might remember this and how if you were following the news at the time. And my reaction to this over a day or two later, with the prompting of a friend of mine, said, why don't you call your friends in Israel and offer your condolences, and your support, your emotional support. And I did that. Now, I hadn't spoken to my salesperson for 10 years because, I'm completely out of that world. I have no contact with them really. So, but I did. I reached out, and sure enough, my salesperson was like traumatized. She's a wonderful person. She's a tough person. She's Israeli. She lives in a settlement, one of the settlements on the West Bank, that there's a whole story behind that too. Whenever you go to the West Bank and you're in an Israeli settlement, you can see the walls, and behind the walls, it's kind of like looking from the United States over into Mexico in places like Tijuana or Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. You look over the wall, you look over to the other side, and you see a slum. And you see very nice, well-managed, beautiful neighborhoods on the Israeli side. And that's the way it is. You when you drive around there, you see how Palestinians are not well treated. They're a permanent minority, a permanent underclass in Israel. Anyway, so I called her and I said, and she expressed the fact that, yeah, this is like the Holocaust. This is absolutely traumatizing to the people in a way. in a way that we would never accept. We as Americans, we don't lose hundreds of people per year to rocket attacks. And then when you look at the population of Israel and the fact that it was something like 3,000 people or so that were affected, very directly affected by the attacks, you look by the massacre that happened on October 7th. You go, that would, the equivalent in the United States would be like 100,000 people, like wiping out an entire city with rape and murder and so forth. So the impact is just enormous. And when you spend any time in Israel, you can feel this. Then you go and you look at the response and you say, well, why are the Palestinians reacting this way? And the response has been brutal, terrible. I don't like to use the word genocide because genocide means something very specific. It's the elimination, the systematic elimination of a whole class of people. And that's not what's going on. What's going on is defensive, but in a extremely brutal way. And it's part of the politics of Israel. And it's part of the politics of the Netanyahu government. And I have a lot of feelings about Netanyahu. Israeli people, including my friends who are definitely Israeli, going to be pro-Israel as much as you can get, are horrified at the way Palestinians are treated. They see it every day. But they're stuck because for them it's survival. And they're stuck. There's a big conservative class in Israel, a bit like the MAGA movement in the United States or the far-right movements in Europe, that keep reelecting Netanyahu out of fear, and that government. But so what I want to do to you is have you understand that there are many sides to this, that the Israeli people are under an existential threat, and that you can respond back and say that they're super, super, especially the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and the way they treat people, and the way the Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, the way they're treated is inexcusable. And both are true. Both are true. The problem in the United States right now is that, especially on the left, there's a strong Free Palestine movement. And of course, we've heard about that in the news, and it's been on a lot of college campuses. I drive by a protest that's continuous, that happens on an overpass over Interstate 5, which is very close to where I am and where my church is. And I see it on a daily basis. They're quite aggressive about Free Palestine. And I go, I'm conflicted about them as well as my feelings toward Israel and some of my intimacy with Israelis. And I look at that and I go, at once I go, thank goodness Christians in my denomination and others are standing up for the Palestinians, because they deserve recognition. At the same time, the Free Palestine movement is highly politicized and in some quarters highly anti-Semitic, and they are in their language, and they have caused a fracture in the American left. Now, so taking a nuanced view of this gets you in trouble. I get in trouble for being pro-Israel when I'm not really pro, and I'm certainly not pro-Israel government. But I also get criticized by people who are more pro-Israel, and they say that I'm being, I'm identifying with the Free Palestine movement. I go, no, I'm very critical of them too. We are in this world, and it happens on the right too. There are our politics toward Israel, especially with Mike Huckabee being the ambassador to Israel, is deeply problematic, and that is a lot of Christians and what we call Christian Zionists in America don't care about Judaism, don't care about Jews. In fact, most of these people think that Jews are going to hell, including Israeli Jews. And the only reason why they're interested in Israel, the only reason why they support Israel is for their end times theology, because they think that Jesus is going to come and, Israel is and the restoration of Israel is going to hasten the coming of Christ, which is completely fallacious, complete misreading of the book of Revelation and its purpose. I've spoken about that before, but I find it very, very troubling. In fact, I find it more troubling than the Free Palestine movement, because at least the Free Palestine movement is trying to protect people. But in the what I call the cynical Christian Zionist movement is they don't care about the people at all. They don't care if they get murdered. They don't care if they go to hell. Honestly, they just want the end times to come. So you can see what the heck is going on here. Well, let's look back a little bit. I was thinking when I was a young person, and I started becoming aware of what was going on. I used to read the Los Angeles Times as a teenager, and I remembered, the 1973 war of Israel. I remember all of the stuff about the Big Peace Treaty, with Egypt and Israel, Jimmy Carter, and all of that. And it was constantly in the news, and I was fascinated by it in one respect, but I was getting really sick of the fact that every day I read the Los Angeles Times, there was a front page article about Israel and Palestine and all of this stuff, and it just drove me nuts. I go, well, wait a minute, is this the only important thing going on in the world? So that was what, 50, almost, 55 years ago, 50 years ago. And Israel was dominating the news as much then as it does today. What is it about this? Well, actually, it goes back a long, long way. Israel has always been, and the Israelites have always been an in-between culture that have set themselves apart. And this is what we read about in the Old Testament. This is part of so much of who they are and so much of who we are, especially as religious people, as Christians, Muslims, and Jews, Abrahamic religion people, look to the Old Testament and look to the Israelites and their plight and how they were always in between. But, you look at it and you go, they became very skilled at surviving with giant superpowers around them. Now, of course, the earliest example of this is the Egyptians and the story of Moses and the story of the Exodus. And this story is foundational for them. But it not only is that story, but it's also the fact that Abraham came out of ancient Samaria, Babylon, to occupy and to settle in Canaan. And then the Egyptians, how they went to Egypt, and then how they resettled Canaan, and how they conquered Canaan, and how they committed genocide at the time. And that generally was genocide against the Canaanites, sanctioned by the Bible. And you look at that and you go, oh, well, this is a very old story. And then you look into the exile and the period of that. Again, the Judahites, because remember, Israel was split, and the northern part of Israel all became part of Assyria and were assimilated into the Assyrians. And then in later generations became what was known as the Samaritans. Um, and the Judah and Judah, which is mostly what we read about, and certainly is the point of the point of view of the Old Testament, is from the Judah point of view, not from the Israel point of view, not from other points of view. It's everything we're reading is about from the Judah point of view, and you look at this and you go, oh, well, they were always either going to be opposing the Assyrians, or which later became the Babylonians, and then they were using the Egyptians against them. And then when the Persians came, they had the favor of the Persians for a little while, but then that changed over time. And it just this back and forth and back and forth, and who they're going to um, side with in order to survive. This became true again with Alexander the Great. When the Greeks came through, they brought, kind of pushed the Persians away. They brought the Greek language to the Eastern Mediterranean, and then the Jewish diaspora grew, and and Judaism spread throughout the region under that umbrella of peace and protection. And then that became a thorn in the side of the Romans. So what we read about in the New Testament, and we read about in Jesus defending the Galileans, who are not from Jerusalem but are Jewish, right? And the Galilean fishermen, that story about opposition to the Romans is a continuation of the story that we read about in the exile and we read about in the Exodus in the Old Testament. And you go, well, wait a minute. The whole national myth, the whole founding idea of Israel is based upon this, about surviving with hostile neighbors. And here we are, 2,000 years later, 2,500, 2,000, almost 3,000 years later, going through the same thing. It's so built in to the mentality of Judaism and of Israel that it makes perfect sense when you think about it. So I thought about this program manager that I was sitting across the table from, who was very, very tough, very brutal toward me in price negotiation. I go, in his mind, he's just he's just being King David in his mind. He's being a protector against me, a Gentile. Against, he's using the Israeli mentality is, yeah, they're the tail wagging the dog, and for a long time that dog was Rome. That a long time that before that tail was the Babylonians, the Persians, and so forth. And so that mentality is so deep within them, that survival mentality. And I don't blame them for that, because you know what? They would be wiped off the face of the earth almost instantly if it were not for that survival mentality that they have. So you look at that and you go, wow. So when you come into the New Testament, you can see that Paul was trying very hard also to manage this, that Jesus, having never left Palestine, Israel, Galilee and Judah, had, although we hear stories about him interacting with Gentiles quite a bit and very kindly and very gently toward them, and also critical of the temple hierarchy and Judaism at the same time. And you go, oh, so even Jesus is in this conflicted world of dealing with people who are obsessed with their survival, obsessed with restoring Israel, but kind of missing the point. And that's a lot of what the gospel story is. But we also see that in terms of what Paul is doing. So Paul in Romans chapter 9 reveals something. He goes, and throughout Romans, he's trying to bring peace between Israel, or between Jews and Gentiles. And he says in starting in verse 1 of chapter 9, I'm speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience confirms it by the Holy Spirit. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I wish that myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my own brothers and sisters, my own flesh and blood. They are Israelites, and to them belong to the adoption, the glory, the covenant, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, comes the Christ, who is over all. God blessed forever. Amen. So here is Paul also conflicted because this is his kinship. He has kinship with these people. He loves them. He loves his history. He was a Pharisee. He also undoubtedly had this mentality that I'm talking about of being with the in-between people and just surviving, having this strong survival instinct. But Paul, is speaking to Romans. He's speaking to Gentiles throughout, and he's going all the way, traveling to Rome. He's throughout the Mediterranean, and here he is trying to reconcile his heritage and the people he loves, the Israelites. And he's criticizing them in a way that I think we can identify with. You can love the people of Israel, you can love Israelis, and you can criticize them and how they're treating Palestinians at the same time. At the end of chapter 9 and verse 30, he says, "What then are we to say? Gentiles who do not strive for righteousness have attained it, that is, righteousness through faith. But Israel, who did strive for the law of righteousness, did not attain the law. Why not? Because they did not strive for it on the basis of faith, but as if on the basis of works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone. As it is written, 'See, I am laying in Zion a stone that will make the people stumble, a rock that will make them fall, and whoever trusts in him will not be put into shame.'" So again, he's saying the Israelites, he loves them. He's saying, you carry this wonderful legacy, but you're rejecting Christ, and it's not about so much about becoming Christian as it is the Spirit of God. And Paul is in the same conundrum, right? He loves his people. We tend to look at this very anti-Semitically if you're a Christian, you're a Western Christian, because you say, well, Israelites are going to, Israel, people who deny Jesus are, they're going to hell and all of this stuff. Paul doesn't say that at all. He wants to bring them along. You have to remember that Paul in Romans here throughout his ministry didn't really see a separate Judaism and a separate Christianity. He just said that Christ frees us all, whether you're Gentile or Jewish, and that he's trying to bring them together. He is trying to overcome the separatism that has been built into the Israelite mentality and that he participated in. Remember, Paul was a Palestinian, or was a Pharisee, and he was murdering and advocating for the murder of Christians because those Christians he saw as the enemy. He saw maybe, most likely, as Gentile incursion into his religion. So, not so much messianic, where he was trying to go out and say, I want to convert the world to Judaism. He saw him more as a threat to the Jewish people. So, the you have to be very careful not to make exact parallels, or to say that God means this for us or God means this for the Israelite people, and that this is the lead into the end times theology, because that's supersessionism. That's taking over. That's not what Paul was doing at all. Instead, you have to see it in this nuanced, maybe conflicted way, and that you can love these people and you can criticize what they're doing in the same way. And I believe that that was what Paul was doing too. He loved the Israelite people, or the Jews. He loved them very much. They were his kin. They loved him. And he talks about that later in Romans when he's thanking all the people in Romans 16. It talks about my brethren. I went, the people Unia and Andronicus, I was imprisoned with them. They're my kinspeople. Well, he's talking about kinspeople. Whenever Paul is talking about kinspeople, he's talking about Jewish people. So, I think that this nuanced way, again, we're living through another time because of the war with Iran, because the Israeli government and Netanyahu goaded us. They were the tail wagging the dog of the United States. They goaded us into a war with Iran that has weakened everyone, has strengthened Iran tremendously. And when we look back at this in the future, we're going to say, "Wow, what a mistake!" I'm sure of it. But again, I understand, or I believe I understand, where the Israelis are coming from in this, and that they're in between. When Hezbollah in Lebanon constantly is basically waging war on Israel, it's not the Lebanese people. It's the it's the Iranian proxies of Hezbollah. And Israel had tremendous advantage, with the fall of Syria, which was, with Assad there, was very, very threatening to Israel. With the fall of Syria, with the almost the decapitation of Hezbollah, with the weakening of Iran over the last few years, Israel actually was sitting in a position of power, but they made the mistake. They got arrogant, and they did it again. And if you look through the Old Testament, you look through this kind of embattled people just trying to find a way to survive. It's when they become arrogant, when they think that they're entitled. That's when they lose it. And here we have another object lesson of that in 2026, of all things. So what I'm hoping that you will get from this is understand that there's nuance here. Don't take sides. Always take the side of being on the side of people who are oppressed. Take the side of people who are being hurt. Pray for peace and justice, but don't take sides politically in the way that has happened. Certainly, don't be a Christian Zionist. I think that is the most cynical, awful thing that we have had in America for the last 100 years or so, at least last 80 years. And it has driven so much of our politics with Israel in a bad way. Don't do that. At the same time, if you support the Palestinian people, the best way to support the Palestinian people is through relief and to have our government oppose what Netanyahu is doing without hurting the Israeli people. To drive a two-state solution, to drive moving away from an apartheid type of relationship with the Palestinians, and promote that instead of saying, I just hate Israel, screw Israel. Worse things have been said, and how and also to call Israelites or Israelis and saying that they're participating in genocide. I think that's very hurtful, because they are not. They are opposing way too brutally, and they are killing people unnecessarily. And the government is being awful, awful, awful. So be a little bit more nuanced about that, and pray for peace. That's what I do all the time when I talk about this topic. I get a lot of flack for it because I have a nuanced view of it. I'm not a Christian Zionist at all, and I'm not a free Palestine and extremist either. I sit somewhere in the middle, and I hope that we can be a little bit more nuanced about that. And I hope that our government will do the right thing in supporting the right people. And with that, I say, people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there. People don't understand that the story of Israel, the story of Judah, that's what we really mean, is all about this, is all about survival, is all about discerning what God wants for them and what God wants for the world. We've benefited greatly from that. But we also are subject to arrogance and misinterpreting it and taking it in the wrong direction. So with that, I say thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful, and God bless you.